My name is Andrew Harris. Did my project on asbestos under Dr. Cross. Let's get to it. First, I'm going to start with the definition of what asbestos is. None of you know. It's basically a group of silicate minerals. They're fibers that are extremely heat resistant, non-conductive, very flexible, durable, so they have a lot of uses. These are the 6 different kinds right here. They're known for their colors, so the first 3 at the top you see there are what are commercially used. The first one right here is the most common form, acetyl, which is white asbestos, andesite, copper white, brown asbestos blue. This actually accounts for 98% of asbestos use. The other 1-2% here also used. So again, they're made, they were used on all kinds of products. They're good for insulating buildings, aircrafts, ships. They're used in military, anything that could help the structure, and also good to fight heat. A lot of clothing, we'll talk about some more of that. Some of the history that we look at, this goes back to 2400 BC. So it was actually found in cookware in Finland, Finnish cookware. Also, it was used in, found in burial shrouds in Egypt. I'm going to skip down a little bit. 1876 was the first real commercial use in Quebec, Canada. Actually, the town was called Asbestos. There's a picture of the mine down here. It's enormous. And then eventually, people start realizing the dangers that asbestos has and what its effects are. And EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, starts fighting against it, starts trying to regulate it, and eventually tries to ban it, and it gets overturned. And we'll get a little more in the recent news later. So the medical side of it, how it is toxic, basically, if you are near it, or if you are an asbestos worker, what happens is when you're breathing in these fibers, they're going deep down your airway path and deep into the lungs. And these little fibers cut and stab into your delicate lung tissue. Over time, ICS, your immune system cells, start trying to fight and break down the fibers. In turn, they lose against these fibers, and scar tissue starts to develop on top of your lungs. Through time, this takes a long time to develop this disease, and eventually adds up so much that your lungs stop functioning. There's so much scar tissue buildup. Your heart stops because you have no oxygen. Some of the dominant diagnoses, the first one is asbestosis. It's for asbestos. This is where you start developing breathing problems and chest pains. The more serious ones, lung cancer, mesothelioma, those are when the pains are getting even worse, even harder to breathe at all, so coughing up blood even. It's really bad. There's not much chance to live much longer. There are treatments, however. Radiation therapy, chemotherapy, you've probably heard some of these, and also surgery itself. Again, radiation therapy is, I watched some videos on that. It's more actually for people who have brain tumors, but you can be done for lung cancer also. Chemotherapy, another cancer treatment, chemical substances, and surgery. There's PD and EPP. I abbreviate those because I cannot pronounce them. I'm going to try. So, but the more aggressive surgery, EPP, is when they remove the entire lung, so it's not pretty. 2 of the most important cases I want to look at today goes back to 1920. Nellie Kershaw was a very big influence in asbestos. Basically, she worked at a cotton mill for a while and then transferred over to one of the biggest asbestos companies in the world, Turner Brothers. She worked as what is called a rover, so she spun fibers into yarn, these asbestos fibers, and the working conditions are very bad. She worked there for 2 years and it already was developing symptoms. And then at that point, she just kind of continued working the next 2 years while she was still working there with those symptoms. She eventually was let go, deemed unfit to work. And she was diagnosed with asbestos poisoning. First diagnosis really ever that caught attention, and she tried to get compensation. She was told to get compensation from the company, and they denied her. They basically said, you know, that's not under the Workman's Act of compensation. We don't know. That's not harmful. You know, no one really knew at that point, and so they didn't give her any compensation at all. She died 2 years later. And then the second most important case was Nancy Lopez. That was more recent. She actually was a judicial administrator in a court, and the U.S. engineering company was renovating the building for a 24-year period. And a lot of asbestos was flying around. She was breathing at her desk. And eventually, she developed mesothelioma, which is that very serious case. And she filed a lawsuit in March 2010 and died not too long from that, in October. And she didn't get the settlement until after her death. Her family received a $10 million settlement. So, quite hefty. But they also didn't take responsibility either, both those companies. So here's some of the mortality rates I wanted to show. They're increasing. Obviously, as I mentioned, mesothelioma is a lot more dangerous. You're going to die much more quickly. And some of these numbers you see, there's actually not people necessarily being infected at these times. So like I said, it's a long process. So people who are seeing, you see these rates here, actually are probably working when they started working back in the 1960s or whatever. So they're just now starting to find those symptoms and starting to get diagnosed and starting to die. So those rates are kind of scary, especially when we consider people not doing anything about it. The actuarial side I wanted to look at a little bit just because that's what I'm majoring in. As an actuary, we're trying to manage risk, uncertainty. Some of the questions that I thought would be very important with asbestos, if you're looking at policies, is do they live or work near asbestos, first of all? If they do, how much time are they around asbestos, even people who are near the mines or not too far from it? What activities are involved? When I thought about people who worked with asbestos, it wasn't even just the fact that they're working right with it and maybe without masks. But it's a very hard job, so you're not just working, you're breathing very hard, breathing deeply, so those fibers are much more easily, much more noted. Do they smoke? How much do they smoke? I know that's a little separate from asbestos, but as far as your health, that's still affecting your lungs. And also pollution and your age. Mesothelioma, like we mentioned, it takes much longer to develop that bad of condition. So Nancy Lopez, she was 56 when she died, over 45. It's very rare to develop something that bad below that age. And then also their family history, they have respiratory problems. Those things always affect as well. I don't want to get into any actuarial models because that is just too complex and takes too much time for me to get into. But one example I did see in a calculus book was a very basic example of basically mice that were exposed to asbestos fibers. And we would have basically the sets where X and Y. X would be the amount of fibers that the mice were exposed to, and Y would be the number of deaths of the mice. So what you can do is, once you do have these data set points, you can obviously find the regression line, which you guys probably know. And obviously, when you have a lot of data set points, you want to use a computer, calculator, whatever, to compute that. But with a couple, you can also use this formula here. And things you can interpret from this, for example, is where it intersects the intercept. These would be mice infection with the number of fibers. That would be no fibers at all. They just died from other, I guess mice would be smoking or something. They died without asbestos from lung-related diseases. The aftermath of all this, Turner Brothers, which we mentioned, luckily fate has a way. They ended up going bankrupt from $500 million in pension deficits. That basically means that this is the money that they could not compensate, that they pretty much owed. And I would say they probably owed more than that, with how many people and how big a company they were in over time. Over 200,000 asbestos cases were pending in circuit federal court, and an estimated $54 billion total. I mean, it's just kind of crazy. And people still fighting to create asbestos. And in North Carolina, for example, there were deadline restrictions. So, for example, if you were diagnosed, you had to file a claim within 2 years, otherwise your rights would be time barred, in a sense. So you wouldn't be able to get any compensation after a certain time if you waited too long. Fraud was another thing. Lawyers saying that they're trying to hide evidence. Too much terrorism. So when September 11th happened, there were a lot of asbestos. They used spray on asbestos on the middle parts structure of the building. Not all of it, luckily, but when September 11th happened, when those towers fell, it was like an asbestos bomb, basically. So a lot of people suffered, not only from everything else, but also that. And then recently, the big mine we talked about in Quebec, Canada, in 2006, they actually shut down. They say it's temporarily, but what's the sad thing is they got this nice little greater than thing. has to do with the fact that they didn't even stop the money because of all these people dying, but because they're waiting on a $58 million government loan guarantee, and also because of low demand in other developed countries. So, yeah, that's pretty much it. Anybody have any questions? No? All right, thank you.